Hi Dragonflies, we're going to continue with this example that we've been working on where we're imagining that we want to paint a painting based on this reference photo, the same one we used to talk about sub-paintings in the last article in this series. And I'm going to use it to talk about making some small changes to your photo so that you have a more interesting painting and maybe an easier to paint painting. So I've just printed this photo out on regular copy paper. I actually usually use a digital app to do this now, but the copy paper is the right place to start because if you get into the digital apps at the beginning, there's a tendency to try to actually make a digital painting. And we just want to make a roadmap for the changes that we're planning. So I'm just going to jump for a moment to the finished version so you can see what I mean by this is not a painting. It's just sort of a diagram for me to work from so that when I do start the painting, I don't forget to make the changes that I'm planning. And it's also a way for me to get an idea of whether I like the changes that I'm planning. So when you're working from a single reference photo like this and you intend to stay fairly close to it, we have a tendency to jump immediately to the question of how am I going to paint the trees? How am I going to paint the reflections? We jump right to the nitty-gritty nuts and bolts before we pause and ask ourselves, how do I want the viewer to interpret this scene? What do I want them to notice? How do I want them to feel? All those things that make for the meaning and emotional impact in a painting. Because I took this photo, I know some things that help me interpret this scene that a viewer of the photo or a painting based closely on this photo might not pick up. For example, this is not a lake, it's a river, and it kind of goes down into the distance there and then around a bend behind that bright green tree sort of in the middle. And I would like for the viewer to be able to understand that. Now, you might not care, you might interpret things differently, but I'm going to use the example of what I would do if I were painting this and making the changes I need to make. So feel free to make other choices, but I want to tell you why I'm making the edits I'm making. So skipping ahead again to the changed version, using the digital image this time so you can see a little better what I'm talking about. I think you can see that the changes that I've made now allow the viewer to more easily interpret that this is a river that goes around a bend. The boat tells you we're going to go down around that bend and on a journey down the river, which is what I wanted to do with my viewer with this painting. Now, you might make other choices. I'm not trying to say this is how you should change this photo. I'm saying if I wanted to create that interpretation for the viewer, kind of let them see that this is a river and that goes around the bend and sort of take them on a little journey down the river with me. This is one way I might edit this photo in not a very dramatic way to help create that illusion so I can make a stronger painting. And in a couple of ways, it's going to make the painting a little easier for me to do. It's also going to make it a little more difficult, but I'll give you a solution for the difficulty if you want to try this and you don't want that difficulty. So because of where I want to put my boat, I've got a bit of a problem. There's a dead tree or something back there in the water that is kind of cluttered, right pretty much where I'd like to put my boat. So not only do I have to find some reference material for a boat, I have to figure out how I'm going to paint a boat in front of all that light colored sort of brushy textural stuff. Except if I pause for a moment and ask myself, does that really help tell the story that I want to tell or create the mood that I want to create in this painting? And the answer is no, it's not really doing anything for me. It's not important. You can't even really tell what it is. So why don't we just get rid of it? And we can do that pretty easily because we can just use the areas on either side of that clutter that we want to remove to tell us what things should look like back there if we just remove that from the scene. And I'd also like to help lead the eye towards the boat a little bit. And again, since I was in the scene, I could tell there was some sun starting to hit the path, the boat ramp coming down, and those shrubs on the right-hand side. So I'm going to exaggerate that a little bit. Imagine the sun's just a little higher up and add a little lighter color there to kind of lead the eye down to the boat. And that also looks like a fairly easy change to make. I can just kind of invent some little patches of lighter green. We don't know what trees are out of the scene on the right-hand side or where the sun might be shining through, so we can kind of put it wherever we want. And then I'd also like that light reflection in the water that's sort of arrow-shaped to extend just a little bit farther to help, again, lead the eye back to where I'm going to put my boat. And I can do that by just making those trees that are reflected there a little bit shorter, or giving them a little bit more of a gap in between them. And again, there's nothing special about the shapes of those particular trees, so that's a change I can make without having to worry about it looking strange. So that gives me a nice place to put my boat where it won't get lost in the clutter. I've got a couple of elements of my painting now that do a better job of directing the eye to that area without being too obvious. And actually, because of making those trees in the distance a little shorter, they already start to feel a little farther away. But if I look at the area underneath that bright green tree, that bank is actually the distant bank, but because of the way the sun hits it, it looks like it's closer. It actually looks like it might be the bank right underneath that. So to create a sense of distance back there, I want to kind of push back the bank and the trees that are above it so that they're really clearly behind that large light green tree. And I'd also like to pull that area with the light green tree forward a little bit. So once again, I use the fact that no one knows what's off the right side here and where the shadows are being cast. So I just darkened that area like it's in shadow. And I darkened a little bit of the foliage in those distant trees as they go behind the light green tree to also put them a little more in shadow and more in the distance. And then I made one more little change. I took this dark tree branch and I imagined that the sunlight was actually hitting it, so it would be a little bit lighter color, which tends to bring it forward and help us see a little more depth in that area too. So with just a few small changes, I've helped create an illusion of more depth. I've taken away the things that might confuse a viewer, and I've created more of the story that I want to tell or the feel that I want this painting to have of here we go off on a voyage down the river. So I know we still need to address the issue of how we're going to put that boat in there, but I want to give you a moment just to compare these two and see how those few little changes change the story from this is a lake that we're just kind of looking across to another bank to we're actually going to take a little boat trip down the river. Now, if you're like me, when I was learning to do this, I would watch someone else do this or read a book where they showed the changes that they make, and I'd think, oh yeah, that makes perfect sense. And then when I would try to do it on my own painting, I would go, okay, so what should I change? So I want to tell you right now, this story that I just told you about how I made all these changes did not go that way in my studio. I tried lots of different things, and I kept the ones that seemed to work, or that I liked best of the options that I tried. So I did not know in advance how this was going to play out. So what we need is a way to quickly and easily try a bunch of different options and pick the good ones, not some way to be omniscient about what changes will automatically work. So a digital painting app is obviously great for that because it's easy to make a lot of changes, but it's tempting, as I said before, to start getting involved in actually making a digital painting and not let it be quick and dirty. So I'm going to show you a low-tech version, what I did for many years before digital painting apps came on the scene, and what I still do sometimes now, especially in classes. And I will also say that there are a couple of questions that are really handy for me to ask myself when I'm planning these changes. The first one is the earlier question that I asked, which is, what experience do I want the viewer to have? How do I want them to interpret this scene? And then as I look around the photo, I ask myself, where are there things in this scene that might confuse the viewer about how they're supposed to interpret stuff? Where are there things that if I didn't know what was going on, I might not be able to figure out just from the visual information that's in front of me? Now, of course, you do get better at making guesses about what might work when you have more experience painting and more experience painting this type of scene. So, for example, I've had some practice at what changes tend to make things look like they're farther away in a scene. So, of course, it's helpful to study what other artists have done to create the effect you're trying to create. For example, a sense of distance in a landscape, as we were trying to do in this situation. But one of the best ways to really learn this is to make some conjectures and try them out and see if you think they're working. So I've printed out my photo on a piece of ordinary copy paper. I use a white gel pen to make light colored marks in dark areas, but you could use a white colored pencil or a white pastel pencil. And then I just need a tube of white watercolor paint or white gouache. Now, if you have a set of all different colors of gouache, you can certainly use that, but you really only need to buy the one tube of white, because if you're going darker color on top of light areas in your photo, you can just use your watercolors. And if you have to put a lighter color on top of a dark area in your photo, you can just tint that white paint with whatever color you need to get something that's light enough and opaque enough to cover. Now, another very important aspect of this method is to use a flat brush if you have one, and that's because flat brushes carry a lot less water. We're going to be using the paint in a out of the tube consistency, very thick, sticky paint. We don't want to get our printout too wet because it's just on copy paper. If you don't have a flat brush, then make sure that you keep a towel or rag close by and dry your brush as well as you can before you start applying your paint to that thin piece of copy paper. So let's suppose I want to start out by getting rid of that dead tree in the background and at the same time making those distant trees a little bit more distant by making them appear kind of hazy. So in a landscape, one of the things that makes things look farther away is what's called atmospheric perspective, and that's just a fancy way of saying the more atmosphere between me and something else, the more it gets a hazy or foggy look. And I actually did that in my sub-paintings, so I'm going to use this one, which I kind of like the look of, to give me some guidelines about what color I would need to make those distant trees to make them look more distant. So I'm using that area in the sub-painting that I like to try to mix a color that will work for testing out this idea. And I think you can see that this paint is quite thick and sticky. I'm trying to use it pretty much the way it would be straight out of the tube. I'm not rinsing my brush very much at all because I don't want to introduce too much water. Now, as I start putting this down, there's quite a bit of reflection from the lights. So I'm going to paint the area and then I'll hold it up so you can see what it looks like without all that reflection. It's not as light as it appears there. That's actually the reflection on the wet paint. And then in the water, I want those areas, those reflections to still be a little darker. So what I'm doing, since this paint is so thick, is just kind of dragging my brush along and letting it deposit just a little bit of paint, and I can sort of keep the dark color underneath. So I'm just very quickly making that change. I'll squint a little bit so that I'm not looking at a lot of detail and see if it looks like it's pretty close to what's going on in the sub-painting that I liked. So I'll just blur this a little bit for you so you can kind of simulate what it would be like if you were squinting at it. So that's close enough for me to get an idea. And also, so if that didn't work, what I do is just print out another one and give it another try. But that seems to be working pretty well, so I'm going to move on to adjust the shape of my reflection, and then I'll adjust my tree line to kind of match. And I'm doing the reflection first because that was what I wanted to lead the eye back farther into the painting, so that's the more important change for me. And then I'm just going to make my tree line match whatever I do down here with the reflection. So I want to open it up a little bit and bring it a little farther back, which means I'll have to make my trees a little shorter and put a bigger gap in between them. And then again, I'll squint my eyes so that all that messy detail is gone and I can get an idea if I'm getting the effect that I want. And this seems to be working pretty well. Color might need a little adjusting, but that's okay. I can just print out another one and give it another shot. So this is a really quick way to test your conjectures about what changes might give you the effect that you want. And it's very low stakes because if something doesn't work out, it's only a piece of copy paper and you just print out another one. So in the space of a half an hour or an hour, you can try out all kinds of changes and then go into your painting feeling confident that your changes are going to give you the effect that you want. And also, you have this as a roadmap so that you don't try to follow your photo and forget to make some of the changes that you wanted to make, which, boy, have I done that lots of times when I thought, oh, I'll just remember that I want to change whatever, and I forget. So this doesn't require you to make any drawings. You don't have to really make a full-on color study. I'm just painting right on top of a piece of copy paper, only making changes where I need them. So you could maybe make just a few changes the first few times you try this, and then after you get some confidence, make more. If you make a bunch of changes and you just think, I've just made a mess and I have no idea what I'm doing, no harm done. You can just go back to following your photo more closely. But thinking this way will start to help you learn what does work and doesn't work. So even if you decide you haven't got a successful edit and you're going to just stick closer to your photo, you'll still learn a lot about what does and doesn't work in a painting by making these little sample versions on copy paper. So I hope this gives you a quick, low-stress way to practice making some changes to your photos and see if perhaps a few simple edits would allow you to tell more of the story that you want to tell or help the viewer interpret the painting the way you hope they will. So I hope this gives you an easy, low-stress way to start exploring what would happen if you made some edits to your photos to make them tell more of the story that you want to tell, to create more of the mood that you would like to have, and make them more meaningful for you, and to make sure your viewer is able to interpret them the way that you intend and have the experience that you want them to have. If you're hoping to ultimately move on to the point where you can combine multiple references to create your own little world, this is a great way to start tiptoeing in that direction. So I hope you'll give it a try.